Hello, my name's Jacob. This show might contain some naughty words. For those boys and girls, please go to your bedrooms, playrooms or watch telly. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Adam Lambert and this is Behind the Life Podcast, a show where I talk to people from all walks of life to go through their life experiences, journeys and paths they have taken. On today's show, I am going behind the life of Neil Woods. Raised in a small town in Derbyshire, Neil went to university in Manchester before dropping out, and on a flip of a coin, he decided to join the police force, where for 14 years he was infiltrating drugs gangs as an undercover police officer throughout the UK. Neil came to see the futility of the war on drugs, demonising those who need help and empowering the worst elements in society. Neil is now a hugely successful author, having penned Drug Wars and Good Cop, Bad War, both striking to the heart of drugs and Neil's career within the police. He's made numerous TV appearances, being a TEDx speaker, and is a chairman of the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition in the UK. Neil, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Can I just correct you on something there? That the law
Absolutely.
enforcement, that LEAP, as we're known by the acronym, we're the same acronym, but we've slightly changed our name. It's the Law Enforcement Action Partnership now.
And how long have you been doing that for then, Neil?
When did I join LEAP? Probably 2014, I think. Yeah, 2014.
And what are the main aims of LEAP?
Well, LEAP is an international organisation made up exclusively of police and other law enforcement figures, and we actively campaign for an end to the war on drugs. I'm on the board of LEAP in the USA and the UK, and in a few months we will be officially launching LEAP Europe in Paris.
So that's your main role now, is within LEAP as the chairman?
But I mean, not just in the UK. I mean, we're expanding across the world quite rapidly.
That's great. Thanks, Neil. We'll rewind and we'll go back to, your career and your journey. So you grew up in Buxton, and you decided to go to university in Manchester. What made you to go and decide to do business studies?
Oh, I have no idea. I can't even cast my mind back to think why that would be a good idea. It was the dullest thing in the universe. Maybe because my dad was a businessman, and I don't know, but it was terribly dull. I was seeking something which had variety and changed every day.
And did you go all the way through university, or was it partway university that you left?
Oh no, I dropped out fairly quickly, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah,
and what was the reason? Just because you were bored of it?
Yeah, it was terribly, terribly dull, and I could see it was never going to get more interesting.
Yeah. So during that time, I know probably obviously what the answer is. What was the best part? Was it studying business studies, or just the huge rise of the acid house scene during that time? Did you really live that student life doing that?
Oh, I went to acid house parties. Yeah, I mean it felt like a revolution going on. To be honest, the music, the change in the music scene in Manchester, it was incredible. It really was, and it was so different. And I'm a big music lover, so the innovation of acid house appealed to me a lot.
Fantastic. So you came out of university. What made you join the police force? Is that true that it was literally on the toss of a coin?
Yeah, I saw an advertisement in the local paper, the Buxton Advertiser. I was thinking about just exploring, going backpacking around Europe, maybe doing some fruit picking like a couple of my friends had done. Mm-hmm. But I saw the advertisements and I thought, well, that'll be different. Right, and it was.
And how did you, find the first 6 months in the job? You've referred in the past that you were a crap police officer.
Oh, I was terrible. I was a dreadful uniform cop. The thing is, I was really young and naive, but I didn't realise I was till I joined police. I didn't realise that growing up in Buxton would make me quite as sheltered as it did. I was raised to think that you could reason your way through anything, and that's not really true, is it? Because you can try and calm someone down and reason with them, and they still want to punch you. So I had some hard lessons when I went to work in Derby, and I struggled, to be honest. I was a young 19-year-old, so it turned out.
You must have had to, really, almost, develop and grow quickly being in the police force. Like say, coming from a small place in Buxton to being, thrown onto the front line. During that time, were you given all the relevant training that you needed?
Oh yeah. I mean, the training was good. I had a good tutor. It was me that struggled with it. You're right. I had to learn very quickly, and you do have to develop quickly to survive in that kind of environment. And I was slow. I almost got kicked out a few times in my first 2 years.
Why was it? Was it underperformance or?
Yeah, I was just slower to develop and learn. I wasn't. I think if I'd waited 2 more years and I'd been a bit more grown up when I went in, I would have found it easier. Yeah. But I survived.
Good. And and then you got your move to, was it Glossop? And is that when you first became involved in in the undercover police role?
Yeah, I moved to Glossop. Got a transfer. Worked with some brilliant people there who helped me develop much quicker, I think. But I got involved in undercover work completely by accident. The reason was it was 1993, and there was quite a shift in policing around that time, and it was caused by the biggest moral panic about drugs that there's ever been in the UK, probably. And there's a lot of moral panics created by media and newspaper, not based on the truth, but just based on panic.
And is that to sell newspapers?
It's to sell newspapers, yeah. It's to sell newspapers. And, drugs are the one topic that journalists have no problem making everything up. Like, they don't have to have any truth at all. So this is the state of affairs we have nowadays, is that what most people think they know or understand about drugs has been based on literally complete lies created by the newspapers in order to sell those newspapers, or nowadays in order to get online clicks. But the biggest moral panic was about crack cocaine.
Okay.
Because the newspapers had been running stories about how crack was ruining America and destroying neighbourhoods for a long, long time. Now, of course, it was having some problems, but it was massively exaggerated. So at the point when crack did hit our streets, everyone was terrified. And this made the government respond, and the Home Office instructed every police, every constabulary, to make drugs the number one priority. So more than terrorism, more than domestic violence or anything else, drugs was the number one priority. So that's where the money had to be spent. So the drug squad, who were the principal detectives dealing with drugs, were told to have attachments from uniform so that the expertise could be shared around, and so more people would understand how to deal with drugs offences. And that's how I got a month attachment. It was just the lucky luck of the draw, really. So I got this month's attachment. The drug squad detectives really didn't like having us rookies around because we didn't know what we were doing.
Okay.
But one of them looked at me strangely one day and said, "Do you fancy having a go at buying some crack?" Which I wasn't expecting that question, really.
How did you react when he asked you to do that?
Well, I thought, I'm game. Yeah, I'll have a go. So I was given this £20 note and told to go to this particular door. I knocked on this door, and this huge guy answered, and he says, "What do you want?" I says, "Well, I'll have a £20 stone, please."
Okay.
And it wasn't too difficult, really. He had a few questions for me, but it wasn't so difficult.
How did you sort of, hide your nerves doing that? Is that, almost part of the act they have to get in to do that, because if that was me, I'd be bricking it, basically, and they would probably be able to see that I'm like, okay.
Well, that's when I started to discover that I did have some attributes which might make me quite reasonably good at it.
Yeah.
Because as soon as I have any, well, not nowadays, but then, as soon as I had any adrenaline spike, it made me think much more clearly and made me feel like I had all the space and the time to think. So I could really mentally navigate stressful situations. So I didn't find it that difficult, really. And he was quite pleasant. He said, don't you take care now, don't get yourself arrested. Which, of course, is important. Which was nice of him, really.
Yeah.
But you see, that's an important point,
Yeah.
that this low-level, ground-level up type of undercover work hadn't really been happening in the UK. It happened in the United States for a long time. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was high-level undercover work. There always has been in police, but not this kind of undercover work. And so dealers like him didn't know that this tactic was around. It was a new thing. They didn't see that threat. So it's an important point to notice that there was very little risk to me on that first occasion. But of course, he went to jail.
Okay.
And he met other people, and quite quickly, jail is an information sharing system, and suddenly everyone knew that there was a new tactic in town.
So that's the difference between level 1 and level 2. So level 2 is basically the job that you were doing, on the ground, so to speak,
Yes.
behind the drugs. What made, the government or, the UK police, bring that tactic in?
Well, it wasn't really a top-down innovation. It wasn't an instruction from above. It was the innovation of the drug squad. That they'd had an attempt to dabble in that with sort of limited success, but for them to use someone who was non-drug squad as a specialist role, that was an innovation from the ground level, really, from Derbyshire Drug Squad.
Yeah. And how long did it take you to get the respect of your other colleagues? As you said, the rookies are often looked down upon. It was like a turning point of what you did when they thought, this Neil's pretty good.
Yeah, well, quite quickly, really, because they were very driven by success. They wanted to win. So they saw the advantage quite quickly. So in no time at all, I was doing a few weeks operation, and then quite quickly, really, it developed so that wherever I went, it wasn't any less than 6 or 7 months, because the job got more difficult, because they knew the tactic was out there. So I'd be sort of then being loaned out to other drug squads, to Leicestershire and Staffordshire and wherever else in the country.
Okay, and you said before that one of the things that you really enjoyed was the art of deception in the job. Why did you enjoy this, and what else did you enjoy about doing the role?
Well, yeah, I did. I mean, the thing is, I was a young man, and it suited my confidence very much to find myself being good at something. I got myself in some dangerous situations and dealt with it calmly, and suddenly I'm thinking to myself, wow, I'm one of those people that can cope with that stuff, And colleagues are looking at me thinking, you're not even broken a sweat, you're some kind of nutter. So it pleased my ego that I could cope with all this. But also I really enjoyed, as you say, the art of deception. And the more complex the operations got, as they did over time, obviously, the more people I was having to manage in terms of manipulating people around me. It becomes an intellectual challenge. It develops the mind, and staying sharp and maintaining that deception was really invigorating.
Looking back now, you eventually became a trainer to train up, the level 2 people, so to speak, but also there was the people there that were level 1 as well. So at your time, before you actually delivering training, there was very little training that you were given.
I wasn't given any training at all. We didn't have any training for me or the other people that were recruited as this new kind of work. No, we didn't. There was no training for the first 3 years at all.
So that day when you were asked, right, what are you going to do today, Neil, is you're going to knock on that door and you're going to buy some drugs. That was it.
Yeah, that was it. There was no training.
Wow. And just for people out there listening who don't know the terminology and the difference between what a level 1 is and what a level 2 is, can you just explain that? Well,
level 1 is the traditional sophisticated type of undercover work. Whatever parts of crime, or that is. And it involves very, very long infiltration, lots of resources going into the building of legends, the back cover stories, that kind of thing. And that expensive and resource-heavy type of work is restricted for the very highest level of policing. So it had previously never been, undercover work had never been used on the low-level stuff, because it wouldn't.
And one of the fascinating things, I've been doing a lot of reading and research into this, is as an undercover officer, whether it's infiltrating drugs gangs or anything like that, for yourself, have a wife and you have kids, and it's how did you get into character? You'd almost like kiss them goodbye in the morning, saying, I'm going off to work now, get into the station, put your trackies on, so you're dressed and look like a scally, and then you're out on the street. Did you how did you find adapting to that, and how did you go about doing it?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say there is that I didn't go to the station.
Okay.
Because covert work very quickly developed in a very secretive way. I'd be away from home for, say, 3 or 4 nights at a time, sometimes longer, and the location would be well away from police. It'd be completely separate from policing. In fact, wherever I went around the country, I would be loaned, because what was set up was the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, so there's a sort of secret unit that was set up to facilitate this kind of work, and so I would be loaned to a constabulary. But the constabulary I'd be loaned to, the support network around what I did, they would be told before I got there they're not allowed to ask me my name, not allowed to ask me where I'm from, and that they could be disciplined if they even ask.
Wow,
so
okay.
I was using the same fake name to the police I was working with as I was to the gangsters. So I didn't go anywhere near police stations. I was cocooned completely from the world of policing, because that's the nature of the work. You're at risk from corruption otherwise. But how did I get into role? Well, I mean, I learnt as I went. I learnt from the people around me and the people I was spending time with, and just empathised with them and tried to understand the motivations of the people around me. Oh, that sounds a bit like an actor, doesn't it? 'Cause,
So there's a fine difference there.
Well, yeah, but undercover cops are not actors. There's no way I could carry a role on a stage. But then, having said that, probably most actors couldn't do undercover work either. It's a very different thing.
And so for the different operations that you were assigned to, as you said before, across the Midlands, whether it be Derby, Leicester, Stoke-on-Trent, etc., how in advance were you given this information that you're going to be put onto this assignment, so you could do your research, you get to know the areas, how people operate around there?
That varied actually for the operation to operation, because I'd do 6 or 7 months on undercover work, and then I would probably be off for 6 months doing conventional policing. So
okay,
I generally had probably about 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks notice for each operation. But I'd still be building legend in between the operations. So I was always keeping a potential cover story ticking over in my head and in readiness for an operation. So, for example, if I was going to go somewhere and say, I used to work the markets in Chesterfield, I'd have to know, where the market traders went for a drink and who was the barmaid on Wednesday. You have to know all of the details. Yeah. So a lot of that can take work.
And was there ever an operation where you were almost rushed into going into it and you felt quite uncomfortable?
Not necessarily from being rushed into it, but I mean there was mistakes from that put me at risk, I suppose. But I can't think there was anywhere I was rushed into it. The job in Leicester in 2001 was a peculiar one, because there were actually 2 operations running, which was always foolish. It always made me uncomfortable.
Okay.
But each operation in different parts of the city was being run by a DI, and the 2 DIs were intense rivals. They hated each other, and so their teams were rivals. And so this caused problems in the way that the other operation concluded in doing all the arrests before mine had finished. So people knew out there that the tactic was going on, which put me significantly at risk.
But how did I get to that situation though, where you've got 2 DIs that are rivals, and I take it, are they after the same outcome?
Same outcome in terms of building their own empire and making their own team look good, yeah.
Right, okay.
But it's, the police is very much full of dedicated and smart operating people, but like any profession anywhere in society, you also have dicks as well. It's just the same as any other job, and these 2 really were a pair of pricks.
Right, okay.
They were talented, they knew their job in terms of investigating and managing a team, but each one of them wanted to look the best.
So have you ever, worked on an operation where, you might have found out at a later date there was another undercover officer from another DI or, from a different department on the same case?
Well, I came across a level 1.
Okay.
While I was working in, where was it actually? That was Northampton. I was working in Northampton, and I ended up coming close to a level 1, and I looked at him because he started as a level 2, the same kind of work as I was doing, and I looked at him briefly, and he just looked away, and I thought, yeah, he's working, and he knows I'm working, which was quite peculiar, and I never did find out the full extent of his job. I wouldn't have asked.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Looking back now onto, subject of corruption. So, this was a question from my mum, by the way. She was a huge fan of Line of Duty, which obviously on BBC last year. Stephen Graham played a role as an undercover cop who got, so drawn into the drugs gang, and he realised, hang on, there is so many, bent coppers out here that were, actually assisting the drugs gangs. How far-fetched from reality, was that? Have you ever come across that sort of corruption within the police force?
Well, you should thank your mum, because it is one of the most important questions
you, Mum.
you could ask. And this doesn't make me very popular with many police who are still serving, any colleagues, but the level of corruption, as pointed out in Line of Duty, is not far-fetched. It's not.
Oh.
There are many far-fetched things about the drama in Line of Duty, but the sheer level of corruption is not exaggerated. And it's time we were honest about that, because if the public was aware of even how much the police know about the corruption, we would have a change of policy. And I'll go into details of why I know this in a minute, but I'll just give you some historic
thank you.
Some historic comparison. Alcohol prohibition in the United States ran from 1929 to the end of 1933. It was a disaster. It gave birth to organised crime. There was no organised crime before that prohibition, and organised crime has been maintained by drug prohibition since. But the thing that stopped alcohol prohibition, really, is the public realising how much it was corrupting the police.
Okay.
Because the newspapers covered it, and they were constantly pointing out the corruption that was going on. Eliot Ness, the famous Untouchables, do you know why he was called the Untouchables?
No.
Because the newspapers, he did a press release and said, well, my officers are untouchable. I don't know what you mean about this corruption. So then the newspapers the next day ran a mocking story calling them the Untouchables. Like, we found them. There are 12 of them. So it was mockery that gave him that nickname, because literally everywhere else it was corrupt. And it was that knowledge of the corruption which ended it. And so knowledge of how the corruption is now needs to end drug prohibition. Now, I came across corruption multiple times. At first by hint, and the structure of the system, for example, when it was explained to me how, I was going to be using the same fake name to the police as I was to the gangsters, that was a clear indication that the institutions around me know how much corruption there is.
Yeah.
Because otherwise that system wouldn't have been brought in, would it?
No.
It's a bit disconcerting, actually, when they tell you, actually, no, don't tell them your real name. No. Do we have to be this scared of our colleagues? Do we? Well, we do, actually. When I did an operation in Nottinghamshire, I'd spent 4.5 months trying to get an introduction to this particular gangster who was connected to one of the big targets, a guy called Colin Gunn, the head of the Bestwood cartel. Absolute maniac. He was at war with everybody. He was shooting people. His gang was shooting people every day. It was a carnage at the time in Nottingham. Well, after I'd met this gangster, it was quite a hard day at the office. He'd interrogated me with a knife pressed into my bollocks.
Wow.
And it's not very comfortable.
That's an interrogation.
Yeah, it's not a very nice feeling.
And why was he putting the knife against your bollocks?
Well, I'd been introduced to him, and he wanted to make sure that I was kosher. I was not a cop. So the next day, it was going to be a busy day, and 2 of my backup team had gone off sick. There was a bug going around the team. So I was introduced to 2 new cops. The first one shook his hand, had no problem with him at all. The second one shook his hand, and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. Instantly, this guy was just wrong to me. Now, when you've been in danger and you've been on the streets doing undercover work for so long, for so many weeks, your senses are really fine-tuned. You're incredibly sensitive to body language. And this guy was wrong. It was, in hindsight, I think it was the way that he looked away and with his eye contact as he shook hands. So I said to the boss, the DCI running it, I said, boss, I can't have this guy knowing what I'm doing. I'm not comfortable with him at all. And he was fine. He didn't question my suspicion. He says, fine, we'll exclude both of them. We'll tell them to park at the edge of the city, and they won't be in the briefing. They won't know what's going on. Okay. And they'll only be here tomorrow. I'll get someone else tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, great. And I didn't think much more of it. Turns out that instinct probably saved my life, because that cop turned out to be an employee of Colin Gunn.
Wow, okay.
Now, not someone who'd been corrupted while he was in the job. He'd been paid to join the police.
Yeah.
Paid to join. And he was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. His name was Charlie Fletcher. You can look him up online. He'd been in the police for 7 years.
7 years?
Before he was caught. 7 years. Now, in the debrief with various senior cops afterwards, they said to me, well, Woodsy, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? Why would any gangster who wants to be successful in an inner city not have moles in the police? Well, why wouldn't you? And of course they all do. This is not uncommon. We know this through intelligence, but we don't very often catch them.
Yeah. Well, how did he end up blowing his cover in the end? Well,
it was a very good and detailed operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary which brought down Colin Gunn. So, sometimes the kingpins are caught, sometimes. But there's always another kingpin.
Yeah.
And actually what the police do, really, is thin out the competition for the most successful gangsters.
Yeah. And so, regarding this corruption and, if it's still ongoing, how high does it go within the police?
Well, we don't know, do we? No. That's the thing, we don't know. With organised crime groups recruiting people to join the police and with senior police accepting that this happens, we don't know. We just don't know. I mean, there's certainly several gangsters around the country you could call untouchable who would at least appear to have got away with murder by corruption.
That must frustrate the hell out of you then.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is, the work I was doing wasn't actually damaging their organisations. It was strengthening the more successful ones. That's what I did over time. I helped strengthen the big organised crime groups, because if I'm getting rid of competition for someone, then the bigger gangs grow bigger, and because they've had their competition removed, they have a bigger share of the market, a bigger share of the pie. And if they have a bigger share of the market, they've got more money, which can be used to corrupt the system.
Yeah.
So the action of trying to police drugs helps create the corruption.
It's almost robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're getting rid of a gang, but then another gang's just going to take their territory.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's the higher level that we're talking about here. Ground level on the streets. You still got competitions between small gangs, but what you've got now is, in any city, the collection of urban street gangs which are dealing, they're all buying from the same person, because the police has made that part of the market monopolised.
Yeah. And did you find that frustrating in your job, though? Obviously, I think I've read you've put people behind bars for over 1,000 years collectively. Are there any of those people that were actually harmless people?
Oh yeah, most of them.
Yeah.
Most of the people who are roped into the drug trade are harmless people, and actually most dealers for things like heroin and crack are user dealers. They're people who have got a problem with substance use, and they are manipulated and exploited by gangsters, and they get roped in and they get sent to prison, whereas really it would have been better to help them.
And are there any any particular people that you got as part of an operation that got arrested and got put into prison that you felt really sorry for? Does anybody stick out?
Oh, there's loads of them. I mean, back in the Nottinghamshire job, there was a guy I befriended who was a vulnerable person. He was self-medicating using heroin to cope with the trauma of childhood, which actually 2/3 of problematic heroin users, that's what they're doing.
Wow.
And there's good academic evidence to say that that's the case. So, if you look down on someone on the street who's using heroin problematically, you're looking down on someone who might be coping with child sexual abuse or physical abuse. So anyway, this one guy in Nottinghamshire, I manipulated him, befriended him, because he was useful to me, to introduce me to people. And of course, he was committing offences on bail. He got roped into it. And when he was arrested and he was in the police station, he ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch.
Wow, okay.
And the reason for that is he saw me as his one friend in the world.
Wow.
Like literally the only person he could talk to, and the only person he found to talk to for a long time. Because obviously, as an undercover cop, that's what I'm good at.
Yeah.
I'm good at befriending people, winning people over, and manipulating them emotionally. And it made him suicidal. And I'm sure he's not the only one who has been mentally damaged by having met me.
And when he was in the station, when did your point of contact end with that person? I take it you didn't see him again. That was just part of procedure.
Yeah, no, I've not seen him again. No, I saw him probably the last time I was with him buying drugs, I suppose, and gathering evidence. Then when my part of the job ends, then the enforcement stage of the operation starts, and it's got nothing to do with me. I just walk away then.
And going back to your day-to-day duty as an undercover officer, you mentioned before about a knife against your bollocks. Was that the most dangerous situation you faced, or is there like a number one when you thought, this is it? I could lose my life here.
No, God, no. There's loads of them. I mean, I suppose the first time I thought I was going to die, and there's been a few times. The first time, I'll mention Fenton because you're from Stoke, aren't you?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Yeah, I've been buying weights of heroin from this dealer in Fenton, and by weights it means I was buying more than just 10 bags. I was increasing my amounts.
Okay.
And he trusted me, I thought, and he was fine. And he operated between 3 different addresses in Fenton. Anyway, I went to get a weight off him. I think I was just going to get a teenth or something. And he opened the door and put a samurai sword to my throat. And his face was blood red, and he says, "You're DS, you're fucking drug squad. I know you are. You're DS, you're heat."
Did he drag you into the house, or were you listening on the doorstep?
And this is outside of the doorstep, and he got me. He got the blade up against my throat, and I really thought, oh, I suppose I had a good run of it.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for 3 years and not got killed. So, but no, I really thought I was going to die, and that he's so angry, and he was spitting and shouting, and then I heard this woman behind him say, "Oh, I thought he was going to say he was then." And this woman just sort of stuck her head out from round the side, and then they started laughing. They were just winding me up.
It was a test.
A test, or maybe he just wanted to try out his new sword. I don't know.
Stoke-on-Trent, yeah.
Yeah.
And how though, you could be seconds away from losing your life, and how do you stay in character?
Well, you have to.
Yeah.
Because the one thing you must always hold on to is your cover, and you never break cover, never.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just by necessity, really.
And I suppose if you had broken cover, he would have used that samurai. So you did.
I can't say that he definitely would have done, but I would say that it's not. It's quite likely he would have done.
Yeah. How did over the years, how did the job mentally affect you?
Well, I mean, as I say, in those early days, that event and other events, I was quite smug,
Yeah.
I was quite pleased with myself that I was one of the people that could cope with that kind of stress. I felt quite empowered and calm, and I could think things through really clearly, and that was great. But I didn't realise it was causing me so much damage. When you have so many of those adrenaline situations, it's an enormous strain on the body and mind. And the after effects and the cortisol and the physiological changes that go on cause damage over time. And now I'm diagnosed with PTSD.
Yeah. But what support did the police offer you back then? In relation to your health and well-being? None
at all. Absolutely none. The first few years there was nothing at all, and then someone pointed out that maybe we should be offering some of the same kind of psychological support that level ones have. And I remember speaking about this with a couple of the level ones over a pint, actually, because I got on with them really well, and they helped us develop the training. Yeah. And they said, there's no way, they said to me, that we would do your job. We think you're completely crazy for doing it. There's no way we would take the risks that you do. And that your job is way more difficult, way more dangerous than what we do. And one of them said, I've never been in danger like that. I have never been physically in danger like you have on multiple occasions. Wow. So they said, so it's ludicrous that you don't have the same kind of support that we do.
Because it's level 2, you are the people on the ground every day dealing with people who are mentally unstable that could just lash out at
Exactly. And the level ones, they did some wonderful, sophisticated work, but they were they tended to deal with professional, clever people.
The people in the suits.
The people in the suits who know what they've got to risk if they administer violence, But a lot of the unpredictable people that I dealt with, they make decisions in the spur of the moment.
In modern day now, is support offered there, within the police force?
Well, I think around 2001 they brought in a yearly meeting with a therapist of some kind. And I used to have this meeting each year. And it was, I say this in hindsight really, because I've had months and months of very good therapy and met some highly skilled people who understand mental health, and I can say, in all honesty, the session that we had then was just a waste of time. It was terrible, and that's all we had. So, at the times when I did have stressful events or near-death experiences, there was no support at all, none at all, and I doubt it's much better now, to be honest, because the police institutions do not really understand PTSD, and what they certainly don't understand is that undercover work is possibly I'm sure it's the worst possible thing to cause it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's great that you're very open about your PTSD. Which is often obviously a lot of the time caused by significant events in some person's life. And when people mention PTSD, you automatically think about people who were in the war, you know, who served in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., but not necessarily with the police force, you know. And I take with your PTSD, you know, when were you diagnosed with it? Was it post leaving the police?
Oh yeah, afterwards. I had a full-on breakdown in 2011.
Wow.
Didn't understand what it was. Treated for anxiety and depression. And I've just been, you know, having appointments with psychiatric nurses and various mental health professionals since. And eventually I got diagnosed, I think 2 years ago officially, something like that. But it takes a while to be sure and be diagnosed.
You know, were the signs of your PTSD coming on over the years?
Oh yeah, it's got steadily worse. It got steadily worse up until about 14 months ago, to be honest. It probably peaked then.
Wow.
And it's, I mean, some symptoms have got steadily worse since.
If you don't mind me asking, you know, what sort of symptoms do you suffer from?
Well, I get periods of very severe, intense anxiety. It verges on terror. Like, you know, I've been in so many frightening situations in my life, and I've never been as frightened in the real situations as I have been as a result of what happens that my mind's created for me. So it's and periods of depression. I feel intense guilt about the harm that I've caused to people, which is quite a rational guilt, really, because I have genuinely caused harm to individuals. I have.
Yeah, I suppose, sorry Neil, I suppose, you know, go back to that example of the guy you were talking about before, you know, when he said that you were the one person that he trusted, you know, and then the next thing, you know, he's behind bars.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and, you know, we have to consider just how brutal a tactic undercover work is. It's incredibly brutal and incredibly intrusive. You know, it's a joke, really, because we used to be instructed on the rules of undercover work before each deployment, and one of those is to pay attention to Article 8 of the Human Rights Act and the right to privacy. So you'd be instructed to consider that and then go out and completely break it. Yeah. You know, because it's an incredibly intrusive thing. Imagine an undercover cop coming into your house and he's not who you think. You know, and I stepped into all sorts of people's lives. It's a brutal tactic that should not be used at all for drugs, at all, because it only causes harm, and it causes harm to the undercover cop doing it.
You know, were there ever occasions where you were working on a job and, you know, you were not just stepping into, you know, a drug dealer's life, but into their families' lives as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd be going into all sorts of different people's houses. Because from my point of view, the more I can befriend people and insinuate myself into their lives, plant myself in their lives, the better. So yeah, I'd get introduced to people's mums and go for a cup of tea in people's houses.
Okay.
And all sorts of things. And yeah, they would have no clue that I was deceiving them.
Have you ever got an example of, you know, looking back now thinking, you know what, they were a bloody nice family, they were, you know, and I cannot believe, you know, their son, you know, is into all of this.
Yeah, but the thing is, even the people who are into it, you know, most people you meet are decent people. You know, they make mistakes, or they're a victim of the circumstances that they've found themselves in. You know, people who have had traumatic childhood experiences, they need understanding and sympathy. They don't need to be criminalised. And actually, most of the people I met were nice people. In fact, often, you know, and I have to say again, you know, most of the cops I worked with were professional and great people, but there was one operation where the people I was meeting in the streets were the nice people, and the cops I was working with were bastards. Mm-hmm. You know, so our preconceived ideas about who is good and isn't, and who's a nice person who isn't, is challenging, I think. I'll give you an example, actually. Yeah. The kindest people I've ever met have been problematic heroin users who are really struggling. Seriously. Yeah. I remember once in Northampton, I had to I found myself needing to act out, not having any money. Because the problem, if you're trying to develop a reputation in a town and suddenly you're the person who can always buy the drugs, and certainly at the beginning of an operation, so this one day I had to play rattling, like I was struggling. So I was there in the morning and I met this girl I'd been speaking to called Uma. And she took one look at me and said, "Hey, mate, you hanging out? Are you struggling? As in, are you withdrawing from heroin?"
Okay.
And I says, "Yeah, man, I'm rattling so much I can't even graft.
Okay.
I can't even do some shoplifting. I'm really struggling."
Yeah.
So she reached into her pocket and gave me £5. She says, "There you go, mate." I says, "Yeah, but aren't you going to use that?" She says, "I've just been sorted, so I'm going to be all right for the next 4 hours. I'll earn that back." And as far as she was concerned, at that moment, I needed that fiver more than she did, certainly for the next few hours. And so she just gave it me.
Wow.
And that's really common. That's really common on the streets. That's really common amongst problematic heroin users, because it's that simple generosity of just helping your fellow sufferer, someone else who's in the same boat as you.
Yeah. As you said, we're not naturally born just to get into drugs, and a lot of people turn to them, almost as a, an outreach because they're going through some personal issues. You look at homeless people on the streets. There's some homeless people who've got they've come from some incredible backgrounds, and for some personal reason, there's been a trigger in their life, and that's it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I was stuck on the streets, homeless,
Yeah.
I'd be using drugs to get by.
Yeah.
I'd be using drugs to take time out of the day.
Yeah.
I know that because that's how I would survive, and that's how most people would survive.
Yeah.
And people need to understand that rather than be judging them, I think. But I mean, Uma,
Yeah.
that girl,
Yeah.
that woman, she said she could stop using heroin, and she said, and she does sometimes, she said, to bring her tolerance down, so it's cheaper, so she'd have a tolerance break.
Yeah.
But when she stopped using heroin, she became suicidal because she then started remembering the sexual abuse she got as a child. So for her,
Wow.
using heroin was a rational decision. It kept her alive because it made her forget. And most drug use is a rational choice.
It's absolutely fascinating, and as you said, you could never break cover in your role of what you were doing, and there must have been times, getting to talk to you now, you seem a very caring person, and there must have been times when you just wanted to almost put your arm around them and say, "Look, just go and get help."
Yeah, well, I mean, I did put my arm around people sometimes. I formed part of that support network that exists, among people like that. Albeit I was faking it, but yeah, but I couldn't break cover. I was very driven by the end result. I was quite aware actually that I was causing harm to a lot of these people, and that the worst thing in their lives was going to be meeting me. And their lives were going to be made much, much worse. But I justified it to myself. I made the decision that the end justified the means.
But knowing that, obviously, it's your job. It's the goal ultimately is for people to get caught and and go to prison. But as you mentioned, these vulnerable people going to prison where the situation's probably just as bad nowadays. You read about in the papers how rife drugs are in prison.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, there isn't a drug-free prison in the world
No.
anywhere, because you can't stop. So we should face up to the fact that if we can't even stop drugs getting into a prison, why the hell do we think we can stop them being used in society?
And why can't we stop drugs getting into prison? Is there a part of corruptness going on in there, or is there a blind eye being turned? What's your opinion on that?
No, it's corruption.
Wow.
Corruption's the biggest cause. The newspapers latch onto this idea that drones are bringing drugs into prison, and it's actually propaganda going on there. That there's control of messaging to a degree from government. The government knows what stories it wants in the newspapers about how it's happening. They want people to think it's drones.
Yeah.
I'm sure there is plenty of drugs getting in with drones,
Yeah.
but it's all facilitated by corruption, and you cannot beat that corruption. You cannot beat it as long as drugs are illegal. You cannot.
Yeah. But what is the end game then? what will, reduce this? I was looking at some figures the other day. I think it's between 2017 to 2018. The amount of deaths by heroin almost doubled. It's spiraling out of control. I think the other day I saw actually you retweeted on Twitter about 2 people that were killed at a cannabis farm in I think it was in Dudley. It's a cannabis farm, and suddenly you're now getting people murdered there. I know that was obviously what the press say is part of a robbery. It's almost like it's a needless death.
It is. That death and all the other deaths are caused by drug policy, not the drugs. I mean, we've had increases in drug deaths every year on year since 2010. We now have the highest drug deaths anywhere in Europe.
Wow.
And that's a scandal that we should be utterly ashamed of, because there are harm reduction measures happening in other European countries that we could adopt and save lives. It's about political will. But you mentioned the murders and the cannabis grow in Dudley. Well, there's no murders going on between brewery bosses, is there?
No.
There's because they, if there's a problem with a brewery, they can go to the police because they've got the cover of the law. So what we've done with drug prohibition is we've created the Wild West. We've created an entire subculture that's like the Wild West, where people are not protected by the law, and it's just the law of the jungle.
Yeah.
If we want to have a lawful, civilized society again, we need to regulate the supply of drugs. We need to take this market away from organised crime.
We move on to the Drug Wars book that you released. Part of what I was reading was even until the 1960s, it was quite controlled within the UK. It wasn't really, even before that, the police didn't see drugs as a priority. They want to go get people who got the guns, etc. Because, it was never really an issue. You mentioned in your book that you could go to Boots and get it as a, prescription over the counter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, basically, international drug policy is a very un-British thing.
Okay.
Very un-British. The international drug policy that the world was forced to adopt is a United States idea. And it's basically United States domestic racism exported by a very aggressive foreign policy. And the reason that we had to follow the United States way of doing things is because it's actually because of World War II, really.
Okay.
Because at the end of World War II, everyone was poorer around the world, apart from the United States. It made them already big, powerful nation a major superpower. And they dictated foreign policy. They dictated what policies people should adopt, which culminated in the Single Convention on Narcotics at the United Nations in 1961. And, we only paid our World War I and World War II debts to the United States just a handful of years ago. So in the 1960s, they had us over a barrel.
Okay.
But we were very, very late in adopting what they wanted to do, very late. And even up until the end of the 1960s, if you had a problem with heroin, you went to the doctor and you got help.
Yeah.
You were given heroin. You were prescribed heroin.
Fully controlled.
Controlled, yeah.
You weren't given any potentially, lethal poisonous stuff. You were given heroin.
Yeah, you were given heroin. And because of that, we didn't have a problem.
Yeah.
Now, in the 1950s and 60s, there were American politicians, policymakers, zealots, here speaking to our politicians, giving them leaflets, trying to persuade them to follow the American way of doing things. But at that point, the Americans measured their problematic heroin users in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Because they'd banned it in 1914.
Okay.
In the UK, we measured ours in the hundreds. In the hundreds.
That is...
At the end of the 1960s, there was only 1,049 heroin users in the UK, and the number was actually falling.
Yeah.
20 years later, from 1970, we had to adopt the American way of doing things, Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. 20 years later, there were 300,000. There's a very clear cause and effect there. The British system, there was no reason for the numbers to expand because it was controlled by doctors with prescription pads. As soon as the whole market was given to organised crime, gangsters like new customers. And so, that's a clear cause and effect. We created the problem by following the American way.
And, that's crazy to know how it used to be, but it makes sense as well. As you said, the Misuse Act came out in the early 70s. You couldn't go and get a prescription, and then these gangs have just thrived, and millions of pounds, if not billions. Like the current, let's call it, illegal drug market in the UK. How much is that worth now?
There's various estimates. I would say £10 billion a year, at least £10 billion a year. Now, it's difficult to quantify, but the Institute of Economic Affairs did a fantastic study on the value of the cannabis market. Okay. So the cannabis market alone is worth £2.5 billion. There are some estimates that the cocaine market is worth over £2 billion. Heroin, again, so it all adds up to at least £10 billion.
And, so regarding cannabis, there's been debates going on for years and years, whether it should be legalised or not. Will that happen in the future?
God, I hope so. It can't come soon enough. I mean, we should really be considering this a child protection issue, because it is far, far easier for our teenagers to get hold of cannabis and MDMA and cocaine than it is alcohol. Like, significantly easier. Yeah. The teenage cannabis market is where drug dealers are, young drug dealers are recruited. Now, if you look at what the successes of countries where they have regulated the adult supply of cannabis, they've had dramatic drops in child usage, which is, I would expect it, because, drug dealers don't ask for ID. You regulate something, you're protecting children. But in all of the 9 or so states in America, they've legalised adult usage, child usage down. In Canada, only a few days ago, they announced the same. They've had a drop in underage use as a result of regulation. Now, Canada hasn't done a good job of their regulation yet, but even in their imperfect system, it's protecting children.
That's fascinating. And, you talk about children and, teenagers on the streets, dealing drugs, etc. There was a bit of research you did when you went to Liverpool, which is where I live now. There was a story about a young person that you came across there. Could you just sort of share what happened?
Yeah, we went to Liverpool because it does have a particular place in the drug policy history of the UK for various reasons, and organised crime has certainly been quite prominent. With characters from Liverpool. So we found 3 drug dealing gangsters of different ages, so that they represented 3 generations. Yeah. One of which was the right-hand man of Curtis Warren. And he got into dealing heroin right at the beginning of the trade. He got into organised crime in the 70s. The second one we interviewed was someone who got into it when organised crime became more organised and corporate and more international as well. So he got into it in the 1990s. And then we interviewed a 16-year-old who had just escaped from county lines drug dealing as part of an organised crime group. Possibly the most important question or interesting question we asked all 3 of these people was, when you were a young man getting into organised crime and drug dealing, how easy was it for you to get hold of a gun? And the first guy, the old mate of Curtis Warren, he says, well, I could have asked. I could have got taken to the higher-ups. That was his phrase, not mine. The higher-ups. And they would have listened to me patiently while I explained that I wanted a gun. And then they would have said, no, don't be so stupid. Why on earth would you want to draw attention to yourself and to me by using a gun? If you've got a beef with someone, go toe-to-toe. Don't be so stupid. Yeah. Second guy, from the 90s and early 2000s, he says, well, we knew that we had access to some automatic weapons if we really needed to, but we'd never let kids anywhere near them because that would be stupid. Mm-hmm. The 16-year-old said, oh, how easy is it for you to get a gun? He says, oh, well, I'd need a few hours. What? And in fact, the last time I needed a gun, he said, I went to the guy, and he says, well, I haven't got one for a bit, but I've got this hand grenade if you want that. And he says, oh, yeah, all right then, I'll have the hand grenade. So he took this hand grenade home. And this was over territorial beef with another gang who had done a front and back, they call it. They smash all the windows in the front, all the windows in this house in the back, rush in and attack the people in there. And what they did is they slashed his father across the face. It almost lost his eye. Now, he couldn't go to the police.
No.
Because the police can't protect people that are part of that underground. You know, you get murdered for being a grant.
Yeah, yeah.
So, as a 15, he was 15 at the time, the automatic thing for him to think is, I need to go and get myself a gun then. So that's what took him there. Now, just have to think about that. That's the change over 3 generations. That's the point.
Yeah.
So if you think back to when, beginning of the 1970s, you've got the war chest of the Misuse of Drugs Act given to police, and the whole market's given to organised crime. Over 3 generations, we've gone from the end of the 1960s with the control of heroin by doctors with a prescription pad to nowadays it's being controlled by 15-year-olds with hand grenades.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. Obviously, again, we read in the press and how much we can believe that's in the press about gun crime, knives in the country, and at the end of the day, would we ultimately say, well, that's down to drugs?
It's down to drug policy.
Wow.
It's down to drug policy because that's a very recent part of our history, and you can see very clearly how things have changed since 1970 compared with how they were in the 60s. Before we banned drugs, there was no crime associated with them at all, because there weren't criminals selling them and there was no one stealing to pay for them. But it is banning them that caused the problems that we now try and fight.
So what made you leave the police then, Neil? Had you had enough? Had you just thought, this is pointless? Because as we talked about before, somebody would go behind bars and somebody would then just go and do their job.
No, I had more of a crisis of realisation, really. In Brighton, where I saw the casual violence being used to control homeless people who were being used as proxy dealers. It just became a vision of the future. It made me realise that. It made me review the 14 years at the time that I've been working undercover. It made me realise that each year the streets got more violent. Each year vulnerable people got exploited more, and the violence was increasing, and society was becoming more dangerous. And I realised, to be honest, I was pretty slow on the uptake because the evidence was there before my eyes, but I was resisting the conclusions all the time because I believed in what I was doing,
Almost tunnel visioned.
Yeah, it is tunnel vision, and cops, they focus on what they do, and the world that I was working in, the covert policing world for drugs, you've got a lot of dedicated people that, they've got tunnel vision and they're working hard to a goal. But finally, the penny dropped for me that actually the reason things were getting worse was actually down to me and people like me. Because police are really good at catching drug dealers. Really good at it. Yeah. If you gave them twice the resources, they'd catch twice as many. Yeah. But that's part of the problem. Yeah. Because where the police develop tactics, organised crime develop tactics back. And it's an arms race. It's never ending. There's a great quote from The Wire.
Okay.
There ain't no drug war. This ain't a war. Wars end. Yeah. And that's the point. It's never ending, and it's constantly an arms race and getting more and more brutal. So the police get cleverer. Organised crime gets more brutal to counter it. And that's actually why we have children dealing now. Yeah. It's been caused by police success. So the 2 tactics which really have caused that is the kind of work I used to do, but also the use of police informants, chizzers, informants, snouts, grassers. 95% of police informants are for drugs offences. So it's a drug war tactic. Now, most informants are recruited when they get caught. So someone gets caught with enough heroin, they're going to prison for 5 years. They're sat in the police cell and they're thinking, I can't face 5 years in prison. Yeah. My kids are going to be too old when I come out. I can't handle this at all. And he knows, because he's been there before, he knows 2 detectives are going to come into his cell and they're going to offer him a deal. You become an informant, we'll do a deal, secret letter to the judge, you'll get half the sentence. So he's thinking, I've got to grass someone up. I've got to get that deal. Yeah. So he's thinking, who am I least scared of? Yeah. Who am I least scared of?
Now we're talking high up the chain here.
It's actually the same system works at every level.
Yeah.
This relationship between police wanting the information and the person thinking, oh God, what can I tell them?
Yeah.
This relationship works at every level, everywhere in the world, all around the world. It works at international level.
Yeah.
It works with Secret Service, with MI5. It works the step down at the National Crime Agency. It works with regional policing. It happens in small towns. It happens everywhere at different levels. And it's that mechanism, that relationship between the person with the information and the police, which is driving the violence. Because the most successful dealer is the scariest, is the one who will not be grassed up because he's the terrifying person.
They're the one who are armed up with all the weapons.
They're the ones who snatch people off the street and torture them because he suspects they might be an informant, just to make sure everyone knows what he'll do to informants. He's the person who makes someone drink petrol and sets fire to them. He's the person who cuts people's feet off or sets dogs on them. I'm recounting real things that real gangsters do, and I know have done. So those people survive because the mechanism of policing makes them more and more brutal. And that can never end. It can never end with this war, because this war doesn't end unless we end it.
So what is the, as of now, what is the British government doing about it? I know you've mentioned in the past that, politicians get a lot of knocking, but there are some good ones out there that are doing some work.
There are, yeah. Unfortunately, our Home Secretary at the moment seems to still believe in the get tough. We must get tougher.
Get tough, don't solve it.
Yeah, but we have to understand it's the getting tougher is the problem.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no party has been good on drug policy. Yeah. The two big parties have both been as bad as each other because they've weaponised it. They've used it to bash each other with. Yeah. They've said, you're not tough enough on drugs, you're not tough on crime, and it's become this sort of football which has been weaponised. But there are now the beginnings of change in all the parties, actually. Because last year I spoke at the Conservative Party conference, the Labour Party conference, and the SNP conference, and we also have allies in the Lib Dems, and my co-writer helped write the Green Party manifesto for drugs. Okay. So Leap have contributed to that. So there is change happening across the political spectrum, everywhere. There are some very good Conservatives, some very good Labour, but everywhere there are really good ones. So you've got the internal campaign for drug policy reform in Conservatives and Labour, and MPs and activists and party members are changing their minds quickly because the evidence is on the side of reform. There's no evidence to support the status quo. There's only evidence to suggest we need to change it.
And almost with a conspiracy theory, as you're talking about how much drugs is worth in this country, which is actually huge for our economy as well. Would you say there are people down in the Houses of Parliament thinking, hang on, this is not a priority because our economy is actually being boosted by billions of pounds a year because of drugs?
Well, I'm not sure if that's part of the mainstream political thinking, but it is a fact that each country has a requirement to state the size of its illicit market. Yeah. We actually do have to declare that in GDP. Wow. So it has to be worked out. I mean, their estimates are under. I think the last estimate worked out by UK government was 7 billion as part of GDP, but we are required by the United Nations to declare that estimate. So it is a consideration. However, the obvious thing to consider there is that could be legitimised. The cannabis industry could bring in an enormous amount of revenue. It could create an enormous amount of legitimate jobs. But this is an important issue. I think legally regulating all of the drug markets is inevitable. It will happen eventually. It has to. And we will look back on this period of time, this war on drugs, as great folly and full of cruelty and stupidity. Much like we look back on when homosexuality was illegal. We look back in horror that how could we have done that, in our history? It was so terrible. Yeah. We will see it the same way. But it's worth thinking about now that when we do have regulated markets, it's crucial that we regulate with social equity. Because, you know, there are some communities in inner cities where families are managing to feed themselves because they deal cannabis.
Yeah.
And you regulate that market and give that to big business for rich men to get richer,
Yes. Yeah.
then you're not considering those communities. So what we have a duty to do is to make sure that equity is considered. You know, we need to wipe criminal records for possession of drugs. We need to forgive people. We need to remove that blight on people's lives, you know, for getting jobs. We need to make sure people can be invested in new business opportunities.
It just looks, speaking from you today, we've just got ourselves in a fucking mess, basically.
Yeah, we have. We really
Let's put
have.
it.
And the first way out of it is to realise that we have caused this mess. You know, that this problem that we're obsessed with is of our own making.
Yeah.
And we were made it because the Americans are of a racist society.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, talking about racism in the US, you know, 80% of people in federal prison and 60% in state prison for drug offences are black or Latino. You know,
Yeah.
why is international drugs policy built on the foundations of racism?
Well, if you go back in the history of the USA, all of drug policy's been around race or prejudice of other people.
Okay.
So even alcohol prohibition, it was about the Protestant political power base feeling undermined by the influx of Catholic immigrants.
Okay.
So you got a lot of immigrants coming in at the beginning of the 1900s from Italy and Ireland.
Yeah.
And because that population was growing, the Catholic political base was growing.
Yeah.
So the biggest group that sponsored alcohol prohibition is actually the Ku Klux Klan. It's the Ku Klux Klan because the only people they hated as much as black people was the Pope.
Right.
Papists.
Yeah.
And so if you look at all the leaflets around the time before alcohol prohibition was going in, that was the dialogue. That was the reasons. So it was about, and basically because they perceived Catholic people to drink more alcohol than Protestants. And they might have been right, but it was about those other people. So that's alcohol. If you consider cocaine was just a remedy. Some people used it in tonic drinks, whatever. It was not seen as a problem, an issue at all, until southern black people were seen to be using it. So, you know, the South lost the Civil War, but they didn't want to free black people. So you had the Jim Crow laws, the continued prejudice against black people. And it was a way of controlling black people. So if they could control and persecute and criminalise the black people who used cocaine, that meant more control, more white supremacy. And that's why cocaine was banned. And you know, you can clearly see that play out in the press at the time as well. Opium, that was about Chinese immigrants. Hundreds of thousands of them brought in to build the railways. As soon as the railways were finished, they didn't like having Chinese immigrants competing for jobs. So they criminalised what they saw as their behaviour. Opium, again, not seen as a problem beforehand. Cannabis. In the Great Depression, Mexican workers coming to steal white jobs, they were persecuted for cannabis use. They even changed the name, because they used to call it cannabis, they even changed the name from cannabis to marijuana to make it sound more foreign, more Spanish, to make it easier to persecute Spanish people.
That's crazy.
And there's famous photographs in areas of America in the Great Depression that on shop doorways, no dogs, no Spanish. You know, the prejudice was incredible, and it was a tool for racists to persecute. That's where our drug policy is just about race. So why would we maintain a policy that's merely been a tool for racist control?
And you can see that's you know why over in America now, you know, it still goes on to a certain extent.
Well, it happens here.
Okay.
Yeah, we've imported the racism as well. You know, if you're black, you're 10 times more likely to be stopped search for drugs in London than you are white. 10 times.
That's a fact.
That's a fact.
Wow.
You know, those figures, you can't argue with them. If you're in one of the worst figures is that if you're in a court, waiting to be sentenced for a drug offence, and you're black, you're 4 times more likely to be sent to prison for the same offence than a white person.
Yeah.
4 times more
That is
likely.
incredible. You know, have you seen it, you know, when you worked in the police, you know, amongst your colleagues, police officers ever say, yeah, that person's black, let's go stop search them?
No. Well, there was one person who
Okay.
I came across with extreme racism. Just one person.
Yeah.
He was a former South African cop. He was a dog handler
Okay.
in Derby in 1989. And he was joking that he taught his dog to bite black people. But that was actually the only overt racism I came across in my whole time in the police.
Right.
So, and again, this is another thing that I sometimes the things I say upset cops because they say, well, we're not racist, how dare you?
It's your opinion.
But the thing is, if I was police,
Yeah.
years ago, before I understood all this, when I was in the police, if someone had said this, I would have been offended. Because I would have said, well, no, because I do my job without prejudice. But the figures are clearly making it that's not true. And it's about unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Of course we have unconscious bias. We used to be a slave trading nation.
Yeah.
Of course we do.
Yeah.
You know, we only
Yeah.
beat it by becoming aware of it. But the thing is that unconscious bias plays out with drug policy more than anything else. So, you know, the figure I used about a black person being 4 times more likely to be sent to prison, that's for drug offences. For normal offences, other crimes, it's only twice as likely.
Wow. Okay.
So, drug policy, it's in the DNA.
Yeah.
Racism is in the DNA of it. And perhaps the explanation for that is that, you know, if you're going out and you think, okay, well, what does a drug user look like if I'm meant to look for them? Maybe it looks like them. You know, unconsciously that's what you're thinking. Because that drug use, it's about other people. It's about other people's behaviour. And let's face it, if we left people alone, they'd be fine. 90% of drug use is non-problematic. 90%.
Yeah.
And this is the United Nations figures. It's not, you know, plucked out of thin air. This is United Nations own figures. So if 90% of drug use is non-problematic, what are we doing? Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Because all we're doing is making problematic use more problematic by stigmatising them and pushing them to the fringes of society instead of helping them.
And that's the problem though with, you know, with facts that you talking, people just put the nose up at them, basically, and they're like, that's just a number you're giving me.
Yeah, well, well that's why the narratives help. That's why the explanations and you know the reality helps, I think.
And you know, for the amount of work that obviously you did when you worked for the police, and that you know you tirelessly do now as part of Leap, doing numerous podcasts, you know, TV appearances. Have you ever felt for your safety any time?
No. I mean, when I was working undercover, I was in danger of getting murdered. In fact, there was some intelligence once when I went to a trial in Leicester that there was going to be an attempt on my life. But that's before I'd given evidence.
Yeah.
Once someone's convicted, no, I'm not worried at all. So, you know, I used to use a pseudonym. I used to give evidence behind a screen.
Okay.
And all that secret stuff. And now I'm public. It's my real name.
Yes.
I live in Hereford. Come and get me if you want me. And because I'm not worried, because the violence in the drug market is just part of the business model.
Yeah.
So it's about reducing risk. It's about, you know, the violence and threats. It's about stopping being grassed up. It's a pragmatic development of a business model. There's no gain to come after me for revenge.
Yeah.
Because that's a high risk with no gain.
Yeah. That
It's just the way the drug markets work.
And so for yourself, on top of you know what you're doing for Leap, etc. You know, you did a TED talk, you know, not too long ago. You know, how was that? How did you find doing that?
That was horrible. To be
Was it
honest.
really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was really horrible. I get PTSD, and sometimes most of the time I'm all right public speaking. It's something I'm quite comfortable with. You know, I've spoken in front of big audiences or travel all over the world speaking, and I'm all right with it. But if I get an adrenaline spike, it can be really uncomfortable. Now, a TED talk is so much more pressure than any other kind of talk.
It's big time.
It's horrible because you in front of you've got a clock counting down from 15.
Right, okay.
15 to 0. You've got 15 minutes and you're meant to get it dead on 15 minutes. And it's meant to be really slick. Now, I don't do slick. I turn up and talk, and sometimes I get everyone points out, and sometimes I don't, but I wing it.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
No pressure. But this was the most horrendous pressure. There was 2,000 people in the audience, and all of the people around you are all very slick and professional, you know, and it's like the guy who was going to go on before me, I saw him in front of the stage, and he wasn't speaking. He was actually practicing his movements, practicing his body language.
Come on.
Even his every little arm movement
What were you
is all
thinking?
rehearsed. I'm thinking, this is absolutely crazy. You know, do they really do that? Whereas I'm just turning up, walk back and forth on the stage and try and remember the right order of stuff, you know. But yeah, I had a massive adrenaline spike about 2/3 of the way in.
Okay.
And I forgot the last third, and I just waffled it.
Yeah.
And I haven't watched it, but people say it comes across all right. But at that point, I was having a meltdown, like a real meltdown. It's like I couldn't speaking and not sure I was listening to my own voice.
Yeah.
I was a mess.
Yeah.
And I escaped, and I was a mess for a couple of days, to be honest.
Yeah,
It was a horrible experience.
What I'll do for the listeners out there, I will put a link to it on
Yes.
YouTube. Because
See if you can spot my meltdown. I don't think you can, but believe me, I was having a hard time.
I thought what was fantastic about it was literally within about 1 minute, 90 seconds, you put the audience at ease. You made a joke about Scally's wearing tracksuits, and you know, as soon as you have that laugh, you know, from an audience participation, you just relax.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
I think
it does help.
you need to do many more of them in the future. What does the future hold for yourself over the next few years?
I'm working with colleagues to launch Leap France.
Okay.
And it'll be the same office where we have the umbrella organisation of Leap Europe. So I'm putting that together at the moment. We're getting the governing board for Leap Europe together, people from Denmark and all over Europe. So I'll be working on that mostly. I'll be travelling, speaking at conferences and media and wherever really. I've got just the normal thing I've been doing the last few years. I've got a conference booked in October in South Africa, Cape Town, Paris in November. Some TV projects, some people I advise on TV, always speaking to news editors and things like that. So it's just busy trying to get people to understand the reality of drug policy, really.
And you must spend hours upon hours, you know, reading about, you know, drug policies, drug issues in all these countries around the world. Do you almost see that as a hobby now? It's something that you enjoy doing?
It's just necessity, you know. I just have to. I need to know the changes. I need to know the developments. I need to follow the politics in various countries, and you know, you can't know everything. And that's why we have allies who are experts in some of the topics more than I am. You know, I know who I can turn to. You know, if we want detail about the science, then we speak to Drug Science, you know, David Nutt's organisation. If we want the details about international policy, we talk to Transform Drug Policy Foundation. Or if we want expertise on decriminalisation, we speak to Release. You know, and there are so many wonderful people in this sphere working so hard, and we're part of a big collective, you know. I'm only one small part of LEAP internationally, and we're only one part of the international movement for change, and it's growing all the time.
Fantastic. And final question, if you go back to the days at university, studying business studies, and you can go back and you can speak to yourself, a younger version of yourself, what would you have said to him then? Would you have said, you know, go on, leave and go join the police?
Oh, God. I mean, you can't regret, can you? I don't have regrets because I wouldn't be able to do what I do now in terms of persuading people of the need to change if I hadn't had the experiences and insight that I've developed over time. So I wouldn't change anything, even though I do feel incredibly guilty about the harm that I've caused, and I am a little bit damaged, but still I wouldn't change anything.
Neil, it's fantastic. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today and go behind your life, and you've had one hell of a life. What I'll do is I'll put all the links to all your work, including where to buy books, etc., in the description of my YouTube channel, as well as your TED Talk link. So thank you very much, Neil.
All right, thanks.
And that was another episode of Behind the Life podcast with myself, Adam Lambert. Please give me a follow on Instagram at Behind the Life Podcast, Facebook, Behind the Life Podcast, and if you're listening to this on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button below as well as the like button. I'll be back soon for another episode. For now, take care.